first about the amazing Peace Corps work that Adam and Sarah have done in Botswana. If you didn't have a chance, and I think only a couple of you were there for their lecture last week, so you haven't heard this yet. And it's amazing what they were able to do and some of the challenges they faced, and then maybe they can talk a little bit about their evacuation as well. And I was hoping that Andrew Honken, who was also in the Peace Corps and evacuated from Uganda, would be able to join us. He was here a little while ago, but I don't see him right now. Maybe he'll be back. But I've asked Adam and Sarah to talk for maybe 15 minutes or so, and then we can have, oh, there's Andrew, good. And then we can have Andrew come in at the end of that, and then we'll have lots of time for discussion. After we do that, we'll do our facilitated discussions for the day, which really deal more with chronic illness rather than the kinds of infectious issues that we're facing as a world today. So I'll turn it over to Adam and Sarah now. And if you put your things on mute until they're done, then we'll have a chance to ask some questions.
Hey, everybody. So I'm Sarah. This is Adam. Like Peter said, we were Peace Corps volunteers in Botswana. We were evacuated a few weeks ago, along with everybody else worldwide. So we did, like Peter said last week, we kind of gave an overview of our service. So you guys can listen to that if you want some more specific details about projects. Today we're going to kind of hone in on some of the sustainability, since it is so important. And so just a quick overview, we served from July 2018 through October 2018, we did our pre-service training. And then October 2018 until just a couple of weeks ago, March 2020, we served in the town of Mahalape, Botswana. It's about 2.5 hours from the capital. There's 41,000 people in the immediate city, but with the suburbs, it's closer to about 60,000 people. The district's very challenging because it has the same resources as much smaller sub-districts. So most only cater to maybe 10 health facilities. Ours had 48, and the same amount of resources. So it's a very challenging area. Any of the maps that you look at for like regions we should target, Mahalape is that really dark, bright spot that's like, okay, this is our hot zone. This is where we need to target services. So that's kind of most of the general information. Anything to add? All right.
Yeah.
Okay. So first, I'm going to talk a little bit about planning sustainability into Peace Corps projects, what that looks like. Adam will talk a little bit about some of our successes. I'll talk a little bit about some of the specific challenges and where we failed, and then Adam will wrap it up to talk a little bit about the evacuation and where we ran out of time because of that. So I'll go ahead and just start. So when you're planning a Peace Corps project, it's kind of a, I guess project's kind of a weird word because a lot of what you do is ongoing. But when you first sit down, somebody comes and says, okay, our community has this need, I want to address it, and I'd like you to help me. Usually the questions we ask are who is responsible, who will be responsible, because just during the project's implementation isn't enough, especially if it's an ongoing regular thing. And many of the most successful sustainable projects are something that you go and, you know, when you're updating your report for Peace Corps, you say, okay, on this date, I did this for this project. On this date, I did this for this project. And you just keep going on. Some of my most sustainable projects, I would say, were something that I started in my first few months of Peace Corps, and then I continually updated week after week, hitting the same project over and over again. So another part of the sustainability question is how do you know it's valuable? Building in monitoring and evaluation tools, whether that be before and after surveys, where you can figure out exactly how much people learned from the programming that you gave. It could be individualized feedback where people tell you that it's valuable. Usually the more you can give a number to the data that you're seeking, the better it is. You don't want to just say, oh, well, it seemed like people really enjoyed that without collecting any hard evidence, because you need to know if this was a valuable thing to do, And if not, how do we either improve it to make it more valuable, or what could we do instead to address the need the community actually has? Another question that we usually ask when we're sitting down with counterparts and trying to figure out how to start an activity and how to make it sustainable is, what skills are transferred and to whom are they transferred? So most sustainability, like most of the sustainable work I did, I would say, was skill transference, where I was teaching somebody how to set up a specific spreadsheet in Excel, or teaching somebody even stuff as simple as resetting the Wi-Fi router. Making sure somebody else other than me knows how to do that. Because if I'm the only one who does it, when you leave, nobody's going to do it. In addition to that, we look at who the skills are being transferred to. Some people are more likely to implement than others. And those, sometimes you'll have people approach you and say, I'd really love to do this activity. Please help me figure it out. And then you sit down to start planning with them. You start thinking about how you can transfer the necessary skills to that person rather than doing it for that person, and they lose all interest. They no longer want to work with you because they actually wanted you to work and them to take the credit, which isn't sustainable because they're not learning anything. It might be a good idea and a great activity for your community, but if it's not something that your community or the people that you're working with can do in their community after you're gone, there's not a lot of point to it. It's a one-off, which is much less effective. So when, like I said earlier, when we're defining sustainability, when we're looking at the practical assessment of sustainability, we're looking at like skills and knowledge transfer. We might also look at behavior change. One of the mantras of Peace Corps during training is behavior change is hard. It's really hard to get people to change their behavior. I can tell Adam just got tense hearing that phrase again, like, oh yeah, that training is rough. It's fine, you'll be fine if you do it. But it's really hard. That's not a lie. It is very difficult to get people, usually when they use that phrase, they're saying, okay, we want to get people to who aren't adhering to like their ARVs to adhere. How do we do that? Like, what can we do other than the repeated messaging that's not working to get that to come through? But it's the same thing with sustainability. When you're talking about counterparts and implementing projects, you, in many cases, have to change their behavior too. And that's where those repeated projects come in. Sustainability doesn't happen as a one-off. Some of the earlier projects I did were not sustainable. I know that now, unfortunately. Like we went in and we'd set up some educational activities maybe, and find that at the end of the day, the activities weren't going to be done again because there was no skills transference and it was a one-off. So I'm going to pass it to Adam for a few minutes.
All right, so kind of to talk about some of the successes we had. I'm not going to get too much into individual projects except for examples, but to build on sustainability, our most successful projects weren't the kind of one-off health education projects that is most of what's being done in the community. Most of our success came very incrementally over a period of time, working with the same person or group of people or organization on the same issue repeatedly, and kind of refining the process and coming back at it. To what Sarah was saying about getting buy-in and getting the community to really be a part of the project, a lot of times you come in and you have your initial couple of introductions and maybe community discussions at like a local KOTLA meeting. A KOTLA is like a community where everybody can come and kind of freely talk about events and different decisions that are being made with the leadership. And so what will end up happening is people think they can get a lot out of your involvement, and they think you'll have access to a lot of resources and you can accomplish a lot very easily. So they'll aim very high initially, and you'll start working in a project with people, and to make it sustainable, you're trying to get them to contribute a lot to it, and they'll realize that it's a lot of work and there might not be getting a lot out of that. individually, maybe the community is getting a lot more out of that. So you go back and forth a lot over a long period of time, sometimes months, if not. I was working with the group for well over a year on deciding kind of how we wanted to plan for some grants, just on what they're willing to put into it, what they're willing to sustain, what's something that they're actually going to get enough out of that makes them want to continue to keep up with that kind of project. And that takes a long time, and a lot of times you're just meeting a lot repetitively, and you maybe make very small like decisions going forward, but you're not appearing to have a lot done. And so people tend to get very frustrated and kind of, well, we want to make stuff happen, so they'll move on to another project and just kind of repeat the process of just kind of talking and not really implementing. And really, you just have to like buckle down and keep at it, because building those personal relationships with people is really important. A lot of people take the basics for granted. Even within the communities we worked in, people knew what the skill sets that they lacked, and or that they thought they would require to accomplish certain goals, in like having a small business or a little stand where they would sell or do something within the community. But they wouldn't reach out and really go after getting that skill set, whether it be running a small business or basic financial literacy. And there were a lot of people that did know these things, but then there was a lot of people that didn't. And it was very difficult early on, because people would ask for a lot of things. And then when you would start working with them, you'd realize that they weren't even sure exactly what they wanted to learn and what they needed to understand. And so just starting very basically and quickly going through a process of kind of at the same time assessing their knowledge and training them up really quickly were where we had a lot of success, just bringing people up to speed really quickly through kind of basic financial literacy. Community mobilization was something that we had a lot more success with in Mahalape than a lot of other volunteers had in other sub-districts. And part of that was a couple of the counterparts we worked with were very enthusiastic and would go out and shake hands and do a lot of kind of that networking within the sub-district that was necessary. And a lot of it was just, we knew we had to get the buy-in from the COSI, which is like the chief in leadership, as well as everybody else within the community, from school administration to government organizations. And that takes a long time, and a lot of people, again, try to move a little bit more quickly, and things will fall apart, or organizations will feel like they were left out as important stakeholders. And so just making sure that everybody feels like they're part of it really helped projects move forward. So I'll bounce back to Sarah for our challenges.
All right, so I'll talk a little bit about the challenges and where we failed. So one major challenge for sustainability, at least in our country, Botswana, was the transfer system. I talked about this a little bit last week, but basically the government can take any government employee and at any time move them anywhere in the country. And so what happens is you'll take somebody, you'll spend a lot of time building new skills with them, and that person will then take that knowledge with them. And sometimes the person who comes in doesn't have that same skill set. And so you have to start over, and you don't always have enough time to teach the new person who's just come in. So now your community is left with the same vacuum that it had a few years ago, because the person who was trained to address that vacuum got transferred out. And so some of the stuff that we were trying to do to address this would be to create training protocols so that there was one person who was unlikely to be transferred, like the head of the district health management team, that's where I worked, who might be in charge of training an incoming person to fill that void. But it really didn't take. People don't like when you, at least in Botswana, people didn't like it very much when I would try to create protocols for them. because they felt like protocol wasn't being observed, or like that's not the role, that's not the way it's been done. And so sometimes breaking through that bureaucracy was a huge challenge. I think one really good example of this is supply chain management, critically important, right? But all of the supply chain management for every healthcare professional that receives it in Botswana is done by Peace Corps. It's not being done by the Ministry of Health. And so the only people who are effectively trained in it are those people who are counterparts of Peace Corps volunteers. Each Peace Corps volunteer that gets trained in it gets to bring one counterpart a year. So that's just not enough people. And the goal is that the Peace Corps volunteers will go out with their counterparts and they'll train other people in supply chain management, so that effectively we'll get these like webs going down where we have Peace Corps volunteers at the top who are on the supply chain management committee, are training Peace Corps volunteers and their counterparts to go and train everybody at the DHMTs, to go and train everybody at the health clinics and the health posts. Which should work in theory, but it doesn't, because there's just not enough time to get to everybody. There's not a Peace Corps volunteer at every health facility. There's not a Peace Corps volunteer at every DHMT. In addition to that, like I said, the training is primarily done by the Supply Chain Management Committee, which is just like a committee that's part of, it's all Peace Corps volunteers. And so we just got evacuated. This is a little bit of where we ran out of time, but we just got evacuated, and now there's no supply chain management committee doing that training. And there's Peace Corps staff, once Peace Corps comes back, we'll be able to train a supply chain management committee to do that training. But in the meantime, there's no one being trained in supply chain management unless being trained by a previously trained counterpart who's probably doing their other regular job, not just training people in supply chain management. So now there's this huge vacuum that's going to need to be addressed once Peace Corps is able to resume services, and ideally should be transferred over to the Ministry of Health at a later point in time. Another major area of difficulty is getting the pressure on people to actually follow through with things. And so it's really easy when you're in a community to put the pressure on your counterparts and say, okay, we said we'd do this, this is the date it's happening, here's what we need to do in order to get it done. It's really easy for you to find yourself being that driving force, but once you're gone, there's no driving force. So you can't really expect that this activity is going to happen. So part of the way that you try to address that is with community buy-in. Adam talked about it a little bit, but if you can get an activity going, get anything going, especially on a regular basis that the community actually responds well to, then hopefully they'll go to your counterparts and they'll be the ones creating the pressure, creating the demand for the activity, saying, we want this, we liked it, we enjoyed it. And hopefully your supervisors, like the locals that I had to report to, like my boss, like my local boss, I guess, not my Peace Corps boss, hopefully they'll create that pressure as well, saying, hey, this activity was doing well while the Peace Corps volunteers was here. Why did you stop? You know, please keep it going, things like that. But in order to get that pressure going, you have to do things successfully and you have to do things with community buy-in, which is just a lot of work. It's definitely worth it, especially if you have done that M&E and you have the data to back it up. But yeah, those are the two areas I thought of. Anything else? Okay, back to Adam for a little bit about the evacuation.
So the evacuation for us happened pretty quickly. We were informed on the Friday the 14th,
13th, whatever it was.
13th or 14th of March, that Friday, that we were being offered what's called an interrupted service. And that's where you can opt to have your service end like a normal service, your Peace Corps service would end normally, but for extenuating circumstances, you're unable to complete your service. So they were offering to, I believe, everybody throughout Peace Corps globally to end their service at that time. And by the next Monday, just 3 days later, it had changed completely to we're pulling everybody out. And at that time, all they knew, they were trying to get everybody out by that Friday. It was a lot of us in confusion at that point. people that were in and around the capital area, whether they were there traveling and visiting, there for a medical checkup, a lot of us were going through that at that time, or just passing through, they were more or less detained by Peace Corps staff. Like they wouldn't let people go back to their sites. They were put up in hotels and
So they were being quarantined.
well, some people that were coming back into the country, yeah, were being quarantined. But they were basically the first group that were being sent out by about late Monday and Tuesday. We went out on Thursday. We came into the Capitol on Wednesday, and we're gone by the next day. And I think they had everybody out by Friday. Anything you wanted to add for kind of our evacuation? Not a lot of sleep, a lot of worrying.
It was probably the most difficult emotionally, but also just getting everything done. It was one of the most difficult weeks of my life, if not the most difficult. It was rough. We weren't ready to go, but here we are.
It happened really quickly for Peace Corps, and there was just a lot of lack of information. But every country has a plan to get everybody out for a variety of different reasons and different ways. And so I believe most of the South African region, most of the countries were able to get out successfully. I think a couple had to book charter flights because their countries shut down really quickly.
Or had military evac come in.
Yeah, military evac was something that was being discussed for a number of people. We didn't have to go through anything like that, but you didn't really get a chance to say goodbye, for leaving things behind, talking about those incremental successes. I was working through a couple of grants for starting up support groups with an NGO that I'd been working with from the start. And we've done everything from just working on putting in financial accountability and protocols to 5-year strategic plan, operating plans, and really grown the organization. And we're starting to do something great. And so I'm a little bummed out that got cut a little short. I know you had community small business training.
Yeah, we were running a financial literacy course for recipients of the Youth Development Fund. Basically, it's a half grant, half loan that people who want to start a business are eligible to receive, but they don't give any like financial skills training when they give out these half grant and half loans. So we were doing that financial skills training. We'd done 5 of 6 modules. The 18th, so the day we got to Gabs and the day before we left the country, we were supposed to do our 6th module. And we were hoping to do one more repeat of the course before we left so we could train somebody up to implement it next year. But I think hopefully it sounds like there's one guy who took the course who would really like to teach it next year, and I think we might have the resources to support him from here, make sure he has all of what he needs. So hopefully that one will continue, but it's kind of up in the air at this point. Yeah. Anything else?
Yeah, I think that's all.
Okay, yeah, that's all that we had. We're open to any questions then.
Well, thank you, Sarah and Adam. I have a number of questions, and I hope students in the class do as well. One thing I failed to mention at the beginning is that both of you are graduates of the University of Montana with the minor in global public health, and you certainly are bringing back to us some very grassroots perspective on what it means to be involved in global public health, and that's wonderful. Before we go to our questions, why don't we invite Andrew now to come in on this discussion and tell us a little bit about his experiences in Uganda, where he was also in the Peace Corps and also a minor in global public health. So Andrew, why don't you take some time to tell us about what you did there and to what extent you see some parallels maybe between your experiences and Sarah and Adam's.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. I just got an email about this earlier, so I didn't prepare anything like Sarah and Adam, but hearing them talk, I definitely saw a lot of similarities with the challenges, with the ways of finding opportunities within your communities and finding projects that can be sustainable. I was in Uganda. I almost completed my 2 years. I would have been coming home in July if we weren't evacuated. I was working in a pretty rural town, pretty far off the beaten path, and in a very small community that really didn't have any exposure to any real development work outside of like Baylor Health coming in there once a month to do safe male circumcision and HIV testing. So I spent pretty much my whole first year of service working just with the school that I was assigned to. I was a community health educator was my position, but I worked with a small primary school that had just started up a few years before I got there. And I spent the whole first year pretty much just showing up to work and trying to find those little ways that I could get involved and try to fulfill those Peace Corps goals that we get pounded into our heads during our pre-service training. And I think, like Sarah said, I spent a lot of time just doing basic skill transfer, whether that was helping people learn how to use the printer or type, or even just use the basics of Word, or like making documents. I helped them digitize a bunch of their homework assignments and things like that. And that kind of became my day-to-day just as I integrated into my community and tried to learn more about what life was like there, because even I had spent a little bit of time in Uganda over the summer in college, and even with that experience, I was amazed by how different just everything worked there culturally, in the workplace, in just the way walking around in the community, half the people not having cell phones, so they just show up and knock on your door and that's how you meet. You can't contact people to try to start groups. So I spent the whole first year, honestly, really struggling to find work that I felt actually related to global health or community health in any way. But that whole year experience really gave me a lot of time to just have conversations and talk with people and learn how they think and how they do things, and forgetting how I did things in the past, and like unlearning my own cultural biases. And in the end of that, we had a few small successes with like hand washing and sanitation and hygiene, a couple of events with like parents and students where we taught them how to make tippy taps, which are like little homemade hand washing stations, and teaching about how illness or germs are transferred and all that. We also, I was told early on that by Peace Corps that they considered me more of a community volunteer, because my organization that I worked with really wasn't very developed. There wasn't a lot of structure. And so I was meant to go out into the community and try to meet others that were doing community health work and find ways of working within that community. So I'd made friends with what they called a VHT, who VHT stands for Village Health Team, and he was a volunteer community health worker at our local health center. And I started working with him, and we were able to go to a local secondary school, and after doing a training on a curriculum called grassroots soccer, we were able to start a club at a local secondary school teaching life skills and specifically teaching about HIV prevention and safe sex practices with boys and girls like around, they were senior ones, so they're around like age 14 or 15, and using the language and activities involving soccer to get that message across and get them interested. And it was a really fun, interesting experience of seeing just the ways that the parallels of teenagers between the U.S. and Uganda. I'd spent a little bit of time in college doing some watershed education with kids around that age, and just like the same things you got to do to keep focus and really get a message that they are going to internalize and actually use to change their behaviors. I think Sarah was talking, the behavior change is hard, and that's something that program really showed me. And it's like, it is a really, really fun program if you have people that are leading it, that are invested in it and are trying to make it fun, trying to make it interactive, trying to use learning styles and things like that, that get the participant engaged, and you're able to use something like football or soccer, sorry, back in America. You're able to use something like football that they're already interested in, that's basically like something that they treat as their second religion, and you're able to use that to put across a really good message about just teaching life skills that could help them stay happy and healthy and avoid HIV, avoid STDs, avoid unwanted pregnancy. I found that to be, for me, a really enlightening experience, and then hopefully for them, something that they can take with them and continue to learn from. And so then after that year, that was part of that whole year of struggling to find things and finding ways of sustainably impacting my community. And then towards the end of that first year, I took some time and went on a little trip and reflected on what I wanted to do to finish out my service and really try to put together some bigger project for my second year. And the one thing that I had noticed in my community just personally was that people were not eating healthy foods. You were seeing kids walking around with the kwashiorkor, I can't say that word, but the extended bellies, stunted growth. And so I wanted to focus on nutrition as something to really address in my community. And throughout the year before, I had gone to a training for sustainable gardening practices and trying to start a movement of like home nutritional vegetable gardens. And that was something that when I brought it back to my community, I saw, people were really curious about what I was doing, because everyone there were farmers. They all knew how to dig. They all had so much wealth of knowledge about how to grow, because that was their livelihoods. But then when I started that project, I got the best feedback that I had seen out of anything that I had tried to introduce or talk with people about. And so my second year, I really focused on building with my organization a school demonstration garden to try to show the kids and teach the kids there at the school and also their parents about some of these more modern, climate smart, bio-intensive permaculture practices. And I knew they weren't going to do it unless I could also do it or show them, like, show them by my own experience. And I ended up, building. I was just finishing up when we got evacuated this whole demonstration garden, and I worked with a couple counterparts to bring the parents together from the school and form them into these little village health groups that we could meet with these smaller groups to start teaching them new, giving them some good information about nutrition and how they can be providing for food on their plate for their kids, and start these home gardens. And I got to see, over the past few months, I got to see some of my friends that I'd worked with and counterparts that started their own gardens at their homes to start being those positive deviants and those initial change makers within the community, and getting their feedback of how they enjoyed it, how easy it was. I was really looking forward to these next few months of pushing it to that final stage where I really truly felt like we were leaving something there that was going to continue on without me, and really without much work or maintenance. It was just going to take a few more trainings and a little bit more work on the school garden. But I'm hopeful that I'm keeping in contact with some of my friends there, coworkers at the org, and they're talking to me about what they're planting, and hoping to give them some support from over here from now. That's pretty much that's 2 years of service right there. I guess I did one other. I worked with my female counterpart to do a dreams group. I don't know if I saw somewhere on the lecture schedule that you're talking about dreams in a few weeks. I think in the whatever it is lecture series. But I did a dreams group, working with adolescent girls again. DREAM stands for Determined, Resilient, Empowered, AIDS-Free, Mentored, and Safe. And so we had a small youth group of girls around P7, so like 8th grade age girls, teaching them about a bunch of different safe sex practices again, teaching them about themselves, their bodies. It's kind of like a sex education, but Uganda style, I guess. It was, so that was another thing. Unfortunately, my counterpart who I was working on that with had a complication with her own pregnancy and was out of the office for about the last 7 months. So that was another one of those first year projects that I struggled with. But I think overall the Peace Corps experience, it was a really, really enlightening experience to learn after taking, these courses in college, and it was a really cool experience to get out there and just kind of be a part of that grassroots and really see what it is like on the ground. And I think one of the biggest lessons that I took away, and I think a lot of people in Peace Corps take away, is that there's no right answer or one right answer. There's no one right way to do things. It's really finding your way into a community. It's finding what that community wants itself and what they're hoping to achieve, how they're hoping to improve. Because everyone, at least in Uganda that you talk to, they know they're in a developing country. They know that they have they're living in, they would say, the third world, and they have this view of America as this perfect utopia, and they have these things, these specific things that they want to do and to improve their own lives, and they're just looking for a little bit of guidance. They're not looking for you to do it for them. They're not looking for you to, maybe they're looking for you to give them money, but that wasn't an option for me. and I don't think it's a sustainable option. But it was just such an experience of running into so many obstacles, tripping over them and falling down and getting up the next day and finding a new path, finding path of less resistance, or finding a path of least resistance. And just so many lessons of resiliency. And yeah, I would recommend it to anyone who's seriously considering it, because I don't know if there's a better way to educate yourself in such a short amount of time about what like the real world of global health is like on the ground. And it was really cool to meet people in Uganda who had a Peace Corp volunteer as a teacher 20 years ago, and then talking about how that experience had affected them. It was cool to meet expats in Uganda who were now doing really awesome jobs with USAID or other NGOs that had done Peace Corps 20 years ago, and they still looked at it as something that had a huge impact on their lives. Yeah, I don't know. Sarah and Adam really hit on a lot of the nitty gritty, I think, of what a general Peace Corps experience is like. But is there anything else you'd want me to talk about? I guess I didn't have anything prepared.
No, I think that's all really great. I'm sitting here listening and thinking that the students in this class are so fortunate to have had the three of you talk about your on the ground grassroots experiences and share with them the insights that you had about sustainability, the challenges that you faced. You know, I guess I have a couple of things I'd like to contribute, but I don't want to dominate this. I really want the students to have a chance to ask you some questions. But one of the takeaways for me is how being in the Peace Corps really requires you to be extremely flexible and creative. You have to be able to come up with your own plans and find, like you put it, Andrew, find out what the community really needs. You go in there with some ideas, but really what you end up with at the end is something that you never planned, you never expected. And that is a really, I think it's a great, it attests to the abilities that you have that you probably didn't even know you had when you went there. To be able to come up with those kinds of serendipitous opportunities and really make the most of them. So, you know, that's one of the takeaways that I have. But let's get some comments and discussion going from the class too.
I have a quick question. So what does your return process look like? Or is there going to be a return process with the Peace Corps back to where you were originally?
So at this point, like we just got an email earlier today, it looks like the soonest they might start returning volunteers is September. That's their estimate at this point in time. We really don't know what that'll look like. We don't know if like our cohort would be able to basically serve a third year as extendees or really any of that. September is about the time we were expecting to come home anyway. So for at least Adam and I, we probably won't be going back, and they are going to give like an expedited process to anybody who wants to apply to serve a full 2 years somewhere. If they apply to serve in their original host country, they may or may not be in their original community. But at the moment, there's still a lot of unknowns. Anything to add, Andrew or Adam?
That's the same as me. I was also set to be home July, so I wasn't planning to go back when I got all this news. It was going to be too much of a whole nother transition to make it back, especially with that caveat of not being guaranteed you go back to your original community. But I know there was a lot of volunteers that I spoke with in the whole I met in the whole evacuation process that had just arrived in country, and yeah, we're really looking forward and hoping to go back for that, to complete out their service. But it sounds like the posts, like they're keeping open Peace Corps offices at least as long as they can. So all the infrastructure, all the staff are staying on. I think some of them might get like furloughed, at least like local staff. But everything is going to be there for now, for them to have a pretty seamless reinstatement of volunteers. And hopefully, I doubt they'll bring in new volunteers until like next year, but I don't know.
I had a question. I'm Anne, not Stan Sneath. I had a question about what sort of education does the community get prior to your arrival? Let's say they've never had Peace Corps volunteers before. So what does the community know about you all before you come?
Usually, at least in Botswana, the way it's structured is each community is supposed to have basically 3 volunteers, one after the other. And so when you have that first volunteer, their host organization gets to learn a little bit about what the Peace Corps does. There might be some leadership in the community who gets a little bit of information, but it's really not very much at all, because the volunteer wants to be able to respond to the needs of the community. So they really leave it open for what a volunteer's roles and responsibilities are, so that they can kind of do what they need to effectively. But a lot of times the first volunteer to ever come to a community spends almost their entire service just building relationships, just gaining trust, just getting people to know them. And then that second volunteer can start really implementing those activities, maybe continuing some of the things the first volunteer was able to start, usually not until their second year, because really you're just building relationships. And the third volunteer is supposed to kind of wrap up those activities and really hammer home the sustainability aspect. That's the model. I don't know if that's the same in every Peace Corps country, and I don't know how well it works. I haven't been able to speak to any, 1s, 2s, and 3s. Yeah.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah,
Thank you. Oh, go ahead, Andrew.
Oh, I was the first volunteer in my community. Uganda kind of does it like that. If there's an organization that was working well with a volunteer, then they'll try to replace that volunteer and get another one in. But I was the first volunteer in my community, and I would say really all they do before you get there is Peace Corps staff will come to that organization a couple of times and talk with the staff of the organization you're going to be working with, but not any sort of actual outreach into the community, really. And then once you get there, you're supposed to spend your first 3 months just integrating into your community. And that's really, I think, where like the Peace Corps volunteer themselves are the ones trying to spread, like teach the community about who they are, what they're doing, why they're there. And there's even a little bit of structure within Peace Corps where staff, at least in Uganda, would the different staff would come visit and work with you to walk around and meet different community leaders, and work with like your supervisor to be introduced to like the mayor of my town and the in charge at the health center, and just like introducing you to the boda men, the motorcycle drivers, and yeah, but so it really lands on the Peace Corps volunteer, I think, a lot of just making sure that the community is, you're open, you're meant to, you've got the language now, you're meant to get out there, and I still have it pounded into my head how to say the 3 goals of the Peace Corps in Ruporo, my local language, because that was something that's like, oh, who are you? Oh, I'm Andrew. Oh, what are you doing here? I work with the Peace Corps. Oh, what's the Peace Corps? The Peace Corps is blah, 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 blah. Like, so yeah, I don't know. I think maybe that answers your question.
Yeah, yes, thanks. Thanks very much.
Yeah.
Sarah, were you and Adam the part of the third wave, or were you early? It sounded to me like you were kind of like
Mahalape was an exception. They kind of had ongoing volunteers, at least since I think we were maybe the 7th or 8th. There's volunteers as far back as the BOTS 12s. We were from the BOTS 19 cohort. So, but Mahalape is a hotspot. And part of that too is it is such a large town. It's about 60,000, like I said. And so a lot of the volunteers who end up there are at different organizations. There were 3 of us in the town while we were serving. So some of the people I'm thinking of were working with other organizations than mine. I know I was at least the 4th or 5th with the DHMT. And before that, they had a health, like clinic and health team volunteer, that's my sector, who was working at a clinic there rather than at the DHMT. But Peace Corps in Mahalape has been ongoing for a long time.
And for me, there was a year-long gap between the previous volunteer that worked at the District 8's coordinating office that I worked with. And then I think there was a couple-year gap between him and the person before him. We actually were lucky enough when we were in country, we had a couple that had been placed in Mahalape as Peace Corps volunteers at the 13th group, and we were the 19th. So they were here about 7 years ago, and we kind of got to see the differences. But he was only 2 back from me at my placement. There was only 1 in between. So there's a lot of gap years, and it just depends on whether or not Peace Corps can arrange housing, safety and security. There's a lot of different things that have to align for Peace Corps to be able to place a volunteer at site. And sometimes it's just not capable to keep that continuity, which is why sustainability is so important, because a lot of Peace Corps volunteers try to set something up with the thought in mind that there'll be a Peace Corps volunteer after them. And even if there is, that volunteer may not have the right skill set, or they may not have really any interest in continuing somebody else's projects.
In addition to that, our site had a very high rate of volunteers electing to do an early termination of their service, just for a lot of varied reasons. And so a lot of those early, like laying the groundwork relationships, volunteers would start to build, and then they would pull out and head back home, which sometimes cause a little bit of damage, where people are like, oh, but I remember this Peace Corps volunteer didn't do what they said they were going to. So that's something to, I guess, consider very carefully when you're considering Peace Corps, is really, can you do it the full time? Because if you start to build those connections, and I mean, it's totally okay to pull out. Sometimes you do have to. There's nothing wrong with that. But it can be a little bit damaging to the people that are left behind. So, yeah.
One of the things that I also came away with after your talk is, and something that I think is really important, is that public health really is so encompassing. It's not just epidemiology, it's not just education. You got into some really interesting stuff, with everything from teaching people how to use Word to financial literacy kinds of things. There's a lot of, the whole transfer thing that you talked about, Sarah, was one that I encountered when I was teaching public administration in Ethiopia as a major drawback of public administration in that country. So, there's a lot of development kinds of issues that are economic that you got into as well. So, how did you feel about that? I mean, did you feel that you could handle those more encompassing kinds of roles than just a very specific health focus?
I found I actually thrived, I feel like, in some of those that weren't directly health focused, simply because, like, there's only so much you can do, especially when you're working within a bureaucratic system. And sometimes you get stuck in the weeds. You get stuck behind the red tape. You can't do the projects you want to, even if they're the skill set that you had. And doing things like Word and Excel, teaching some of the other people who I was working alongside at the DHMT, you know, how to write up a report, how to make it legible, how to present, working on public speaking skills, things like that. There were all little things that would make a difference in the way that health information was communicated, both up the chain to the Ministry of Health and then back down to clinics. And so I felt like in terms of what I was actually qualified to do, those things were more manageable and more meaningful. In terms of the financial literacy, I did definitely at first, when somebody came to me and asked for us to do it, I felt a little bit out of my depth. It's like, yeah, I know how to build a budget, but is that enough? And we pretty much found we could find the information that our community needed with some quick Google searches. We were fortunate enough to live in a place where we could have Wi-Fi and could do that, get that research done. And I mean, a lot of it, like when you're talking about financial literacy, we're not talking about running a Fortune 500 company and all the ins and outs of that. We're talking about building a budget. We're talking about doing some basically data analysis to figure out how your company's doing, to understand fluctuations, to understand, you know, how things are changing over time. And those are things that I do and that I do as part of, you know, data management for public health. Just we're looking at numbers with a dollar sign rather than numbers representing individuals. So overall, like it wasn't, I don't think it was too much, and it really was what my community needed. I honestly wish we'd done more of the like economic stuff, because that was really an area that my community needed a little bit of boost for.
Yeah, that's a great answer. But you know, Andrew, I want to ask you this one. You know, I just try to think about if I was in your shoes, I wouldn't have known anything about community gardens. How did you manage to? How did that come second nature to you, or how did you manage that?
I mean, it was a lot of working alongside the experts, the locals who are expert farmers. But I went to a 5-day, like week-long training to learn this specific permaculture technique that was developed like in Tanzania for specifically like climate smart agriculture. So I had that on my back, and then the manual they send you home with. But then we made our first one and it failed. It totally like got trampled by goats and children, and it was like, okay, well, let's learn from it. And it was like, okay, well, we need to build a fence. We build a fence. Once we build the fence, we have a gardening space. And now then it kind of just became this, you know, it was them teaching me about their seasons, their planting times, their, you know, what needs to be transplanted. That stuff I relied on the locals. They were the experts. When it came to what I was able to give them was, you know, some of these techniques that they otherwise would not have had exposure to, and just trying to get them thinking outside of the box when it came to growing what their like foods, and thinking about what is food, or, you know, how can I, even what she was talking about, the economic side of things, like people kept telling me, oh, well, are you going to give me seeds? Like, no, I'm not going to give you seeds, because if I give you seeds, what are you going to do next season when those seeds are gone? And then trying to work with them to, like, I was working with one of the kids that I became really good friends with, and working with him, he was interested in beekeeping, and that was huge in Uganda as an income generating activity. So I started working with him to do that, and just Googling a lot of stuff about beekeeping so that he could have the money, which he started getting a small income, to then be able to buy his sukuma wiki seeds or his tomato seeds. But yeah, I would say I've always been interested in gardening, and my parents gardened a little bit when I was younger. But as far as who actually had the knowledge. It was the locals that I worked with who had been farming their entire lives. And all I was trying to do was try to make them think about like soil health and how they can manage water and these things that they didn't really consider before, that were hopefully that were meant to make their lives easier and make their gardening and farming practices more oriented towards the modern climate, where we no longer had normal regular rainy season and dry season. It was a mishmash where people's crops were either getting burnt by the sun when it was supposed to be raining, or they were getting drenched by the water when it was supposed to be sunny. I relied on locals a lot.
Yeah, that's really wonderful. Well, let's see. Are there, I really want the class to think about the fact that you've got these 3 former students, not too far ahead of you, who are here for another couple of minutes if you'd like them to be. Do you have any questions you'd like to ask?
I was just wondering, with these like really interesting experiences you guys went through, how has your like career goals and like your future plans evolved from before you went to after you've come back? How has it evolved?
For me, I definitely was able to figure out what I want to do, which was pretty nice. I was kind of bouncing around a lot, like, okay, maybe I want to just do public health. Maybe I want to do a PhD in immunology. Maybe I want to do an MD. Maybe I want to do, I just didn't really know. But getting on the ground, working a job that honestly sometimes I really didn't enjoy. We kind of gave you the highlight reel. Some days were really hard, but I think it helped me hone in on what I really want to do, where I really want to make an impact. So now I know that I'm going to be heading towards medical school. I do want an MD, but I also want an MPH, and I want to focus on infectious disease. I'm still really interested in neglected tropical diseases. That's one of my areas of passion. And I would really like to work on providing like both education, but mostly like mitigation strategies to countries that are going to be dealing with the effects of like climate change, or countries that are going to be dealing with the effects of like vectors migrating into new areas related to climate change, related to like humans going into new environments, encroaching on the species that are already living there, stuff like that. Like most of the negative effects of that are going to be in developing countries. And I would really like to be somebody who mitigates, who steps in early, creates a plan, steps in often, and keeps that from spiraling, especially among people who may not have the resources to do it just by themselves. So in a lot of ways, the career I envision myself having maybe like 10 years from now, it's going to be a while, is a lot like what I was doing with my Peace Corps service, but on a more sophisticated scale.
Okay. For myself, I kind of generally knew I wanted to continue working in public health. So I was looking at a Master's of Public Health program, and through the Peace Corps, you can get access to Coverdell, which can help with tuition and some other resources. And they have a lot of MPH programs available. So I was thinking about that ahead of time, but through some of the experiences that I had over the 21 months or so we were in Botswana, I really more focused in on crisis management as far as public health is concerned. We had a lot of things that came up where there wasn't a lot of support, and you really had to handle situations on your own. And Sarah and I think worked really well through that, and I found I worked really well creating and executing a plan quickly and under pressure. So I enjoy that. I thrive doing that. And it just kind of focused more in on something that I was already thinking about. And for a long time, I I wasn't sure exactly what I wanted to do, and kind of bounced around and kind of settled back towards that towards the end of my Peace Corps service.
Andrew.
Yeah, for me, I was a stereotypical pre-med student in college, and part of what motivated me to want to do the Peace Corps was when I was getting to that time of graduation and trying to figure out what I wanted to do after, if I wanted to go to medical school, if I wanted to go for an MPH or something first. I just felt like I didn't have that real world experience to really justify why I wanted to do anything. I felt like I had the education, I had the knowledge, but I wanted to get out there and have some experience in the world. And so I think Peace Corps, I spent a lot of my time on those rough days when I was just sitting in my house without electricity, sweating, just thinking about and reflecting on, what I want out of a career, and really just, answering that question of why and what kind of career I want to have. And I came out of it still wanting to go to medical school. I'm trying to do my applications right now. But really, like, it gave me more ideas for like a trajectory in a career in medicine that I'd want. Like, I also want to try to do an MD, MPH like Sarah, and like even further on into a career, like realizing how health and medicine is so much, like, there's so many things you can do in a community, even just as a volunteer. And like, my goal has always been like rural medicine in Montana. I'm hoping to get into the WWAMI program. Like, that's what I want. And just like taking those experiences from Uganda and realizing that like there's so many parallels to our lives here, and trying to see different ways of even if it's like community gardening in wherever Montana, anything like that. Like, I feel like it gave me the inspiration to really feel like medicine is the career I want to do. It gave me the justification, and it gave me a vision for like what it could be like in 10, 20 years when in an established career. But I guess that's pretty much, I would say, how it affected my career.
That was a great question. I'm really glad that you asked that. I think that's a good way to end this very informative and inspirational discussion that we've had. And I'm really proud of the three of you. I really want you to know that you've gone on to do some really amazing things in a very short period of time following your graduation. And that suggests to me that your future is very, very bright. So I'm glad that you've decided to continue along those lines. I think we've talked in this class about how there's a need for public health people and from a wide variety of different fields around the world. I hope you continue to keep your international interests alive, and that you will be able to, at some stages in your career, make contributions back to places that are underserved. And I think those contributions will be welcomed and really valuable. So I can't remember if we know how to do the clap function here, but why don't you all unmute yourselves and thank Andrew, Sarah, and Adam for their discussion today.
Thank
you, guys.
Thank you for all that you've done for these countries and also for yourselves.
No, you don't have to stay with us any